I want to tell you about a power station in Nigeria. Here is the situation. More than 50 years ago, somebody stood on the plateau in northeast of the country, right here on the map, did the calculations, realized that if they capture the rainfall and runoff from the plateau, they could generate 3,000 megawatts of electricity, enough to power nearly a quarter of Nigeria. It will become the largest power project the country had ever tried to build. So they drew up the plan, ran the studies, signed the contract, and then they signed them again and again, one government after another, for half a century. And in all that time, the project had produced exactly 0 watts. What it had produced is close to $1 billion in spending, feasibility reports, surveys, preliminary work, a mountain of invoice for a power station that if you flew out there today, you genuinely could not find because there's nothing there to find. Which raises a fairly obvious question. If nothing ever got built, where did the money go? The deeper you look, the stranger it got. Because the minister who signed the headline contract, $6 billion, the biggest in the whole saga, is right now on trial for fraud, accused of awarding it without the approvals the law required. A different minister, the one running things while the money was actually moving, just got sentenced to 75 years in prison for diverting it. The company that won the deal has dragged Nigeria into a courtroom in Paris, demanding over $2 billion. And to fight that off, 2 former presidents got on planes to France to swear under oaths that the contract should never have existed in the first place. 50 years, more than a dozen governments, a trial on another continent, and sitting at the center of all of it, a power station that was never at any point actually built. This is the story of how that happens. If you're yet to subscribe to my channel, kindly like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comment section. Now back to the video. To understand why Nigeria became so focused on this remote part of the country, you first have to understand why the Mambilla Plateau is almost perfectly suited for hydropower. Unlike much of Nigeria, which is mostly flat and dry, the Mambilla Plateau is cool, elevated and wet, rising around 1,300 meters above sea level. It gets heavy rainfall every year and finishes at a dramatic cliff edge overlooking the lowlands beneath it. That drop is the entire point. In hydropower, the energy you can pull from water depends on 2 things: how much of it you have and how far it falls. Mambilla offers an enormous volume of rainfall and a fall of roughly 1,000 meters. Very few places on Africa continent combine both so generously. The water comes from the Zungeru River, a system that drains plateau before eventually feeding the Benue, one of Nigeria's 2 great rivers. A Swiss engineering firm surveyed the site back in the 1970s and reached a simple conclusion: build a dam on the plateau, drive the water down through tunnels, bore into the rocks, and you could harness one of the most powerful natural batteries in West Africa. The ambition was so large that Nigeria gave it a nickname. They called it the African answer to the 3 Gorges Dam, the massive Chinese project that became the largest power station on earth. The comparison was a stretch, but the instinct behind it was sound. Mambilla was almost meant to be a statement. So what exactly was Nigeria trying to build? Not just one dam, but an entire system of 4. The design includes Inya, Sonson, and Ungu dams, along with a smaller control structure known as API. Together, they would control the flow of the Zungeru River and store water for the dam. From there, the design turned dramatic. The stored water would run through 33 kilometers of tunnel carved through the mountain, then drop down vertical shaft into 2 underground powerhouses, cathedral-sized cavern hollowed out inside the rock itself. 12 turbines would sit in those caverns, each driven by water arriving under massive pressure after its 1,000 meters plunge. The combined output, 3,050 megawatts. That figure is worth sitting with. Nigeria's largest operating power station today, the Kenji Dam, built in the 1960s, topped out at around 760 megawatts. The newer Zungeru hydropower plant had roughly another 700. Mambilla on its own would produce more than those 2 and every other major dam in the country put together. Once finished, it will be the single largest power plant Nigeria has ever built and one of the largest hydroelectric schemes anywhere in Africa. The electricity will travel out along hundreds of kilometers of new high voltage lines, joining the national grid at Jalingo and Makurdi. The government estimated the project will create around 50,000 jobs, irrigate new farmlands, and help control the seasonal flooding that batters communities downstream. Everything about the design pointed to transformation, which is what makes the next part of this story difficult to explain. Because for 50 years, the thing standing between Nigeria and all that power has not been the mountain, or the rain, or the turbines. It has been the country's own politics. The Mambilla dream began under General Yakubu Gowon, the military head of state who first commissioned the studies for the project in 1972, in the year after Nigeria's civil war. Gowon never built it, nor did the man who came closest to that early era, Shehu Shagari, the president of Nigeria's Second Republic, under whom a roller compacted concrete dam was actually started on the plateau in 1982. The military returned, the economy buckled, and Mambilla was left to the grass. It would take another generation and the return of democracy in 1999 for the project to rise again. And here the pattern that defines this whole story setting. Olusegun Obasanjo, who governed from 1999 to 2007, revived Mambilla and in his second term awarded a sweeping contract to build it. His successor, Umaru Musa Yar'Adua, cancelled and re-awarded the deal before his presidency was cut short by his death in office. Goodluck Jonathan, who followed, channeled money into national power projects but left Mambilla untouched on the ground. Muhammadu Buhari signed yet another agreement in 2017, flew to Beijing and personally asked China president to help fund it, then left office in 2023 with not a single turbine installed. And then came Bola Tinubu, the current president, who promised once more to restart the project only to suspend it almost immediately. 6 presidents, one unbuilt dam, each inheriting the same promise and each handing it untouched to the next. To understand why, you have to go back to a single contract signed in 2003 and a company most Nigeria had never heard of. In early 2000s, a Nigerian businessman named Leno Adesanya had been quietly promoting the Mambilla project, even helping arrange some of his first talks between Nigeria and China. His company, Sunrise Power and Transmission Company, wanted to build the dam itself. And in May 2003, in the closing stretch of Obasanjo's first term, Nigeria then Minister of Power Oluwagunloye awarded Sunrise a $6 billion contract to do exactly that on a build-operate-transfer basis, meaning the company will construct the dam, run it, and eventually hand it back to the state. There was one problem. According to the Nigerian government, that contract was never properly approved. Obasanjo himself would later insist he never authorized it and asked in public where his own minister found the power to sign away $6 billion. That single disputed signature has haunted that project ever since. When later government tried to hand Mambilla to Chinese state firm instead, first China Zungeru Group, then a wider consortium backed by a nearly $5 billion loan from the Export-Import Bank of China, Sunrise refused to step aside. The company took Nigeria to the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, demanding more than $2 billion in compensation for breach of contract. That arbitration has dragged on for years. In early 2025, it reached an extraordinary moment. 2 former Nigerian presidents, Obasanjo and Buhari, traveled to Paris to testify in the same case against the same company. At home, the corruption question multiplied. Nigeria Anti-Graft Agency, the EFCC, charged Agunloye over how the original contract was awarded. And in 2026, a court convicted a more recent power minister, Saleh Mohammed, sentencing him in absentia to decades in prison for laundering tens of billions of naira tied to the project, money for a dam that was never built. And here is the painful part of Mambilla's story. Why the lawyers argue? The light kept going out. Nigeria is home to more than 200 million people, yet its national grid struggled to deliver even a fraction of the electricity the country needs. The grid collapsed repeatedly, Tens of millions of homes and businesses run on noisy, expensive diesel generators. Economists have argued for decades that unreliable power is one of the single biggest brakes on Nigeria's economy. Some estimates suggested it could meet a significant part of Nigeria's electricity demand, while also allowing the country to sell excess power to nearby nations. The comparison that stings most comes from Sudan. Around the same time Nigeria was awarding its first modern Mambilla contract, Sudan, a country then living through conflict, built a major hydropower dam of its own in roughly 5 years. Nigeria, stable and far wealthier, spent those same years in courts. Every year of delays carries a cost of measure, not only in dollars, but in factories that never opened, students studying by candlelight, and economic running well below what it could be. So where does that leave Mambilla's story today? As of 2026, the most ambitious power project in Nigeria history still exists almost entirely on paper. The Plateau remain untouched. The Paris arbitration that could finally clear the legal paths or hand Nigeria another enormous bill is still grinding towards a ruling. Chinese contractors remain on standby, and once again, the government says construction is about to start, just as government has been saying for the past 50 years. What makes Mambilla remarkable is not that it is hard to build. The engineering was solved decades ago. The real problem was never the engineering. It was the human side of it. The contracts, the court battles, the politicians, and the promises made for headlines but later ignored.